Hello, friends. Welcome to this new episode. Today, we're going to talk about Bruce Lipton and his theories. Bruce Lipton's proposal centers on a fundamental idea: cells are not governed solely by genes, but by the interaction between environment, perception, and biology. His approach, developed mainly in his book of belief, challenges classical genetic determinism and proposes that our beliefs and list directly influence genetic expression and the body's physiology. To understand his theory, we need to understand the context. For decades, the prevailing idea was that genes control our biology almost automatically. We inherit a program, and that program determines health, behavior, and destiny. Lipton, drawing on his experience as a cellular biologist, began to observe something different. While studying stem cells in culture, he noticed that cells with the same DNA could develop in completely different ways depending on the environment they were in. The DNA did not change, the environment did. From there, Lipton adopts and promotes the concept of epigenetics, which studies how external factors can activate or deactivate the expression of certain genes without altering the DNA sequence. According to this perspective, genes are not a fixed destiny, but a set of potentials that are expressed or not depending on the signals the cell receives. This is where he introduces his most distinctive point. For him, perception of the environment is just as important as the environment itself. The nervous system interprets reality. Based on that interpretation, sends chemical signals to the body. If we perceive threat, the body activates stress responses. It releases cortisol, alters immune function, and shifts biological priorities toward survival. If we perceive safety and well-being, the body activates processes of growth, repair, and balance. Within this framework are not merely abstract ideas. They become perceptual filters that modulate internal chemistry. A deeply rooted belief can keep the body in a chronic state or, on the contrary, in a state of openness and regeneration. From this perspective, the mind influences biology through perception, and perception is translated into molecular signaling. Lipton also proposes that many of our beliefs are formed in early stages of life, when the brain operates predominantly in frequencies associated with hypnotic states. During those years, we absorb information from the environment without critical analysis, forming subconscious programs that later guide much of our behavior and physiological responses. Thus, many of our automatic reactions do not arise from conscious decisions, but from acquired programs. Another important aspect of his theory is that cells, according to his interpretation, are not merely biochemical machines, but intelligent systems that dynamically respond to environmental signals. The cell membrane, not the nucleus where DNA resides, would be the true brain of the cell, as it is the structure that detects information and decides which internal processes to activate. In relation to manifestation or conscious creation, Lipton's theory is support the idea that changing beliefs can change biology, and that a coherent internal state can generate measurable transformations in health and life experience. However, it is important to point out that, although epigenetics is a solid and widely supported field, many of Lipton's broader interpretations, especially those linked to quantum manifestation, are viewed with skepticism by the conventional scientific community, which considers them oversimplifications of extremely complex processes. Lipton's ideas do not arise in a vacuum, nor exclusively from the spiritual domain, although they have later been associated with it. They stem primarily from his training and work as a cellular biologist in the 1970s and 1980s, particularly his research on stem cells and cellular behavior in culture. The starting point of his proposal lies in classical cell biology. Lipton studied how genetically identical cells could differentiate into different cell types depending on the chemical environment in which they grew. Even sharing the same DNA, cells could become muscle, bone, or fat tissue depending on the environmental signals received. This phenomenon, already known in biology, but he interpreted it as evidence that the environment plays a dominant role in gene expression. From there comes his adoption and popularization of epigenetics. Epigenetics, created not by Lipton, as an established branch of biology, studies how external factors can activate or silence genes without modifying the DNA sequence. This field has solid scientific foundations and has developed since the mid-20th century, with significant advances in recent decades. Lipton takes this scientific framework and makes it the central axis of his proposal. Genes do not determine destiny, they respond to signals. The next step in his theoretical construction comes from his interpretation of the role of the cell membrane. In traditional biology, the cell nucleus, where DNA is located, was considered the control center. Lipton emphasizes that the membrane, being the structure that detects and interprets environmental signals, functions as a processor that decides which genetic instructions to activate. This idea is grounded in real knowledge about cellular receptors and signal transduction, but he expands it philosophically by describing the cell as an intelligent entity. The most controversial leap in his thinking comes from integrating these biological concepts with psychological theories and a particular interpretation of quantum physics. Influenced by holistic currents of thought from the late 20th century, Lipton connects epigenetics with conscious perception. He argues that not only the physical environment affects the cell, but also the organism's interpretation of that environment. In other words, perception filtered through beliefs generates biochemical changes that impact gene expression. Here we can see the influence of cognitive psychology, psychoneuroimmunology, and the study of stress. Science had already established that prolonged emotional states affect the immune and hormonal systems. Lipton integrates these findings into a broader narrative. Beliefs shape perception. Perception modulates internal chemistry. Internal chemistry regulates gene expression. The more metaphysical dimension of his arises from the cult context of the 1990s and early 2000s, when the idea of linking quantum physics and consciousness became popular in self-help and spiritual contexts. Although quantum physics does not directly state that individual beliefs alter macroscopic reality, Lipton adopts quantum language as a metaphorical framework to explain the interconnection between energy, information, and biology. His ideas derive from three main sources: experimental cell biology, the development of epigenetics as a scientific discipline, and integration with psychological models of perception and stress. To this is added a holistic interpretation that expands these findings toward a vision in which consciousness, beliefs, and biology form a dynamic system. What distinguishes Lipton is not that he discovered epigenetics, but he brought its implications into the realm of personal responsibility and conscious transformation, building a debated bridge between biological science and personal development. The scientific evaluation of Bruce H. Lipton's claims, on the other hand, requires a nuanced and rigorous perspective capable of distinguishing between solid findings of modern biology and the broader interpretations he proposes. At the core of his approach, as mentioned, is epigenetics, a field fully recognized by the scientific community that studies how gene expression can be activated or silenced without altering DNA sequences. Today we know that genes do not operate as rigid, immutable programs, but as potentials that respond to environmental signals. Factors such as nutrition, chronic stress, early experiences, and environmental context influence mechanisms like DNA methylation or histone modification, altering how genes are expressed. In this sense, the statement that genes are not destiny has grounding within contemporary biology, which understands the organism as a dynamic system in constant interaction with its environment. The debate begins not with the existence of epigenetics, with how far Lipton extends its implications. He argues that beliefs directly influence gene expression through perception. Science partially accepts this idea, but with important nuances. It is well established that psychological activates the hymic pituitary adrenal axis, releases hormones such as cortisol, and produces measurable changes in the immune system and cellular processes. Prolonged stress has also been associated with epigenetic modifications. However, this does not mean that consciously changing a belief automatically produces deep genetic reprogramming, nor that any disease can be reversed solely through cognitive transformation. The relationship between mind and biology is real, but indirect, complex, and modulated by multiple physiological, genetic, and environmental variables. Another controversial aspect is his claim that the cell membrane acts as the true brain of the cell. From a biological standpoint, this is considered more of a metaphor than a literal description. While it is true that the membrane conceptors that detect chemical signals and trigger internal biocascades, the nucleus remains essential as it contains genetic information. Cellular regulation is a distributed process involving multiple structures and signaling systems. It cannot be reduced to a single control point. The strongest criticism arises when Lipton links his ideas to quantum physics, suggesting that it supports the direct influence of consciousness on biological matter. Quantum physics describes the behavior of subatomic particles at extremely small scales, and the so-called observer effect refers to physical interactions in measurement experiments, not to human mental intention altering macroscopic reality. Most physicists consider it inappropriate to extrapolate quantum phenomena to psychology without direct experimental evidence. Although the interconnection between physical and biological systems is a legitimate field of research, there is no scientific proof that individual consciousness acts as a quantum force of directly altering matter in an intentional way. However, there are areas of research where Lipton's discourse touches on genuine questions that science continues to explore. Psychoneuroimmunology has shown that sustained emotional states influence inflammatory processes and immune responses. Studies on meditation and emotional regulation have found changes in brain patterns and even in certain epigenetic markers. It has also been documented that early adverse experiences can leave lasting biological imprints. These findings support the idea that mind and body form an integrated system, but they do not prove that consciousness can freely redesign biology without physical constraints. The real point of tension is not the mind-body interaction, which is widely accepted, but the magnitude of influence attributed to conscious will. Biology recognizes plasticity, adaptation, and sensitivity to psychological environments, but it also recognizes structural, genetic, and biochemical limits. Diseases, for example, usually involve multiple factors, and there is no solid clinical evidence supporting the idea that all of them can be reversed exclusively through changes in perception or beliefs. In a balanced evaluation, It can be said that it is correct to affirm that the environment influences gene expression, that perception modulates physiology, and that emotions impact biological processes. It is also true that biology is far more flexible than previously believed. However, it has not been demonstrated that beliefs alone fully reprogram the genome, nor that consciousness acts as a direct quantum agent on cellular matter. Lipton's contribution can be understood as opening a powerful conversation about personal responsibility and biological plasticity, although many of his conclusions go beyond the available empirical evidence. From a mature perspective, the most solid integration lies in simultaneously recognizing our real capacity to influence our biological state through emotional regulation, stress management, and perception, and respecting the deep complexity of the human organism. Current science does not deny the interaction between consciousness and the body. Rather, it carefully defines its scope, avoiding oversimplifications that could generate unrealistic expectations. In that balance between inspiration and rigor lies the most fertile ground for continuing to explore the relationship between mind, body, and reality. Having seen what orthodox science says about Lipton, let's look at what is happening with his ideas today. Currently, there is a broad and active community that follows, adapts, and expands Bruce Lipton's ideas. However, it is important to understand that this phenomenon does not belong to a single author, but to a broader intellectual movement that has evolved over time. This movement combines science, spirituality, transpersonal psychology, and personal growth practices under a common approach: the idea that mind and body are interconnected, and that this interconnection can deeply influence people's lives. Within this context, several approaches have developed, some with stronger scientific grounding than others. A first example is somatic psychology and affective neuroscience. Researchers such as Antonio Damasio, Stephen Porges, and Bessel van der Kolk have explored how the body and emotions actively participate in shaping experience, perception, and stress regulation. While they do not speak of quantum manifestation, they do support the idea that sustained emotions and bodily patterns modify the brain, internal chemistry, and how we experience reality. Another example is epigenetics applied to well-being. Recent studies have documented how practices such as meditation, exercise, nutrition, and stress management may have epigenetic effects. For instance, experienced meditators show changes in the expression of genes related to inflammation and immune response. This does not confirm intention alone, but it does suggest that sustained internal states may correlate with measurable biological changes. Other developments include transpersonal psychology and expanded consciousness currents that integrate psychology, spirituality, and non-ordinary states. Adopting the narrative human perception can influence biological and existential processes. Authors such as Ken Wilber and Stanislav Grof have contributed conceptual frameworks in which mind and experience are not limited to reduced biology. We also find functional medicine, integrative therapies. Some professionals have incorporated Lipton's ideas into clinical practices where attention to beliefs, stress, and lifestyle is used as a complement to biomedical treatments, focusing on the person as a whole system rather than just a set. Symptoms. And what about the future of Lipton's ideas? Will they remain relevant? We are seeing a growing integration between genuine scientific findings and broader interpretive narratives. Increasingly, interdisciplinary research is attempting to understand complex phenomena such as brain plasticity, the influence stress on biology, and the relationship between emotion and health. While these studies do not demonstrate quantification, popularly described, they do open pathways for better understanding the link between subjective experience and biological processes. Moreover, contemporary culture is increasingly interested in holistic approaches. Conventional medicine coexists with mind-body therapies. Psychology incorporates contemplative practices, and research explores the interaction between the nervous system, immune system, and emotions. This creates fertile ground for ideas linking perception and biology to continue evolving with greater methodological rigor and fewer simplifications. New generations of researchers and professionals are interested in integrative models that move beyond reductionism. There is a search for a language that does not place science on one side and spirituality on the other, but instead understands consciousness and human experience as complex phenomena with multiple levels of explanation, without contradicting empirical evidence. This suggests that in the future we will likely see more rigorous studies on how sustained emotional states affect biology, research exploring the relationship between attention, perception, and health, and theoretical frameworks that articulate science and subjective experience without falling unverifiable claims. Those who follow and expand Lipton's ideas are not a homogeneous group, but a broad movement ranging from clinical professionals to consciousness explorers. Their most significant contribution has been to bring biology into dialogue with subjective aspects of human experience, challenging the old separation between mind and body. They have also driven conversations and practices that invite us to see health and human creativity as embodied, complex, and deeply integrated phenomena. This evolving movement points toward a future in which our understanding of life is no longer fragmented, but articulated across multiple levels of reality. Lipton's contribution has been influential because it shifts the focus from genetic determinism to biological plasticity. At its core, his message is that we are not passive victims of our genes, but active participants in how they are expressed. The environment matters, perception matters, emotional state matters, and from his perspective, learning to regulate these factors is a way of reclaiming influence over our biology. His theory reinforces the idea the body is not merely a receiver of mental commands, but a living system that translates perception into chemistry, emotion into cellular signaling, and experience into genetic expression. Regardless of broader interpretations, his work opened a crucial conversation. Biology is not a fixed destiny, but a dynamic process in constant dialogue with consciousness and the environment. Thanks so much for hanging out with me today. Don't forget to follow the show, and I'll catch you in the next episode.